Welcome to this explainer. Today we're jumping right into a really fascinating historical journey. We're looking at how humanity actually managed to solve a completely universal problem: chaotic gatherings. Because, if you've ever tried to get a large group of people to agree on, well, pretty much anything without a structure in place, you know exactly how fast things devolve into an absolute mess. But surprisingly, there's a brilliant system to all this madness, and its history is incredibly rich.
Okay, let's dive into this. Have you ever actually been trapped in a chaotic, disorganized meeting? You know the exact kind I'm talking about, where everyone's just talking over each other, personal attacks start flying out of nowhere, nobody knows what's actually being decided, and you're literally just watching the clock tick away. It's this incredibly relatable modern pain. But the truth is, without established rules, human gatherings naturally devolve into mob rule. It's human nature to want your voice heard, right? But without structured order, the loudest voice simply takes over the room.
So to fix this chaos, we rely on a really foundational concept: parliamentary law. And it literally means exactly what it sounds like: the rules for carrying on the business of a group. And as the name kind of gives away, this whole concept originates directly from the English Parliament. Now, these rules weren't just arbitrarily invented from modern corporate boardrooms. They were born out of a desperate, centuries-long need to basically prevent total anarchy and ensure absolute fairness for everyone involved.
So the crucial point is that any group making decisions together operates as a deliberative assembly. This is actually a fantastic term coined by Edmund Burke. It basically means a group of persons meeting to make group decisions and figure out a common course of action. So whether it's a massive national legislature or just, your local neighborhood association, if you're determining a common course of action together, you are acting as a deliberative assembly. You rely on these rules, whether you officially realize it or not.
Section 1. Roots in Ancient England. Let's head back to the 5th century.
So now that we know what these rules actually are, where do they come from? Well, parliamentary procedure evolved from some extremely humble beginnings. Way back in the 5th century, free men of Anglo-Saxon tribes gathered in what they called village moots, and this was just to make bylaws and administer justice. Then later, after the Norman conquest in 1066, a great council of feudal barons was formed to advise the king. Now obviously it wasn't truly democratic yet, because, feudalism, but it laid the absolute necessary groundwork. By the 13th century, this great council started evolving into the beginnings of the parliament we'd recognize today, eventually splitting into the House of Lords and the House of Commons.
Section 2. The first written rules, famously known as Lex Parliamentaria.
As these governing bodies got larger and way more complex over the centuries, well, memory and oral tradition just weren't cutting it anymore. For a society to function smoothly, its rules for gathering had to be permanently recorded. A great example is G. Petticoat's Lex Parliamentaria. This was a pocket manual prepared for members of the English Parliament back in the 16th century, and the rules in here are just striking. It says, take up one subject at a time, alternate opposing points of view, require the chair to call for the negative vote, and keep personal attacks out of the debate. Sound familiar? Because it should. These ancient 16th century principles are the exact same modern rules we still rely on today to maintain courtesy, justice, and order in our own meetings.
Section 3. Crossing the Atlantic and bringing these rules to the New World. So from England, these vital procedures started crossing the ocean. Early settlers brought these English parliamentary traditions right over to the American colonies, which really set the stage for a completely new era of democratic governance. And those rules took root in America remarkably early. Virginia's House of Burgesses was founded way back in 1619. By the time the First Continental Congress convened in 1774 to talk about resisting the British Empire, the members already had enough procedural experience to conduct their business quickly and efficiently. And when the Constitutional Convention met in 1787, these established procedures were the literal tools that allowed representatives who, by the way, had incredibly deep, fundamental disagreements to navigate a tense political revolution and successfully frame the United States Constitution.
Section 4. The Early American Manuals and the effort to customize the rulebook.
But, of course, a brand new nation meant brand new challenges. As America started establishing its own unique identity, new customized rulebooks started popping up so they wouldn't have to rely entirely on British texts. Thomas Jefferson actually published his own Manual of Parliamentary Practice in 1801. He did this specifically to stop arbitrary, unchecked abuses of power in the Senate while he was serving as vice president. Meanwhile, you had Cushing's Manual, which came along to try and help smaller, voluntary organizations. Cushing recognized that groups with unpaid delegates and much shorter meetings really didn't need the heavy, overly complex rules of a massive legislative body.
But there was a really massive catch with Cushing's approach. His manual essentially told organizations, hey, follow fundamental parliamentary law, but then it required them to adopt their own specific rules of order. Which sounds great in theory, right? But in reality, voluntary organizations completely lacked the time, the expertise, and frankly, the sheer will to develop their own parliamentary rules from scratch. So despite Cushing's absolute best efforts, countless voluntary groups across America were just left in total parliamentary confusion.
Section 5. Henry Robert seeks order and his quest for a truly universal system.
So someone desperately needed to step in and fix this massive confusion for the everyday citizen. Enter our final hero, Henry Robert. He stepped up in the 1860s to finally synthesize centuries of historical trial and error into one unified, totally accessible system. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is Robert's powerful, almost counterintuitive belief. He said, where there is no law, but every man does what is right in his own eyes, there is the least of real liberty. Robert firmly believed that true democratic freedom actually requires strict, agreed-upon rules. Because without them, the loudest voices just take over, and the minority gets entirely silenced. Real liberty literally needs structure. And you know, his motivation for creating this structure was highly personal. Henry Robert was a U.S. Army officer who was unexpectedly asked to preside over a church meeting one day, and he completely botched it. He literally had no idea what to do. It's a highly relatable, kind of funny anecdote. But driven by his own personal frustration and the deep embarrassment from that totally disastrous meeting, he made a firm vow to thoroughly learn parliamentary law and figure out a universal solution for the masses. As he traveled around the country with the Army, Robert discovered a totally chaotic landscape. Every single organization he visited was using completely different rules. And even worse, as he studied the standard works of his time, those manuals by Jefferson, Cushing, and Barclay, he found out they fiercely disagreed with one another on major fundamental points of parliamentary law. He quickly realized that a universally recognized, definitive set of rules was desperately needed if small organizations were ever going to function smoothly.
Let's move to and see how this builds into his ultimate triumph. He wrote his own manual, Robert's Rules of Order. And when the first edition was published in 1876, the public hunger for order was so immense that it completely sold out its initial run of 3,000 copies in just 4 months. I mean, that's huge. It proved exactly how instantly popular and critically necessary his definitive guide to parliamentary procedure really was for the American public. And Robert's true genius was really in how he distilled all that complex history into clear, actionable principles. He established that, sure, the majority rules, but the rights of the minority, and even absent members, are always meticulously protected. A quorum has to be present to legally do business, and you must take up business one item at a time. He just beautifully combined the ancient English traditions and early American legislative experiments into this wonderfully simple, balanced system that protects absolutely everyone's fundamental rights.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a provocative question. The next time you vote on a motion or sit in a deliberative assembly, ask yourself, are you just following some dry, boring rule, or are you actually participating in a 1,000-year-old tradition of democracy? The rules of order aren't just annoying red tape. They're the direct result of a long, incredible historical struggle to bring fairness, equity, and order to human gatherings. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the totally fascinating history of parliamentary law.